In this lecture, we're going to look about river management techniques and how they can vary between traditional hard engineering techniques and more recent soft engineering techniques. And then finally, we're going to look at an example at Pickering in Yorkshire, where there's been various attempts to manage the river there recently. Now, in the previous section, we highlighted that via the processes of erosion and deposition, rivers like to move. It's part of what they would naturally do across a floodplain. But we also noted that floodplains themselves have been built up by deposition during river floods over long timescales. So rivers move and rivers flood. The problem is that we also like to build on floodplains. There are large areas of fertile, flat land close to a good water supply. So it's no surprise that some of our earliest human settlements were around rivers, and building activity is still focused on floodplains to this day. Humans have long since managed rivers. We can divide the ways in which we do this into two categories: hard engineering techniques and soft engineering techniques. Hard engineering techniques typically involve some sort of construction. Perhaps the most obvious thing to do is to build a flood wall or embankment or flood barrier to build up the natural river banks and prevent water from escaping from the main channel. Here is an example of a flood wall being built on the River Aire as part of a wider flood alleviation scheme in the Leeds area. These may be expensive to build, but it's generally a one-off cost, and it allows more water to be stored in the river channel. But the downside is that they can look a bit ugly and unnatural, and they take away these desirable riverside views. More problematically, this approach encourages water to be rapidly conveyed downstream, which could actually make the downstream flooding problem worse. Similarly, rivers can be straightened or dredged to help them convey more water rapidly downstream and allow the channel to store more water. Again, this can increase the risk of flooding downstream, but also by dredging a river, you're actually working against the natural process of deposition that put that sediment there in the first place. Most likely, that dredged sediment is just going to be quickly replaced by the river, so it would need to be repeated regularly. Another option is to build a flood relief channel. These are artificial channels that can take water away from the river in times of high flow and transport it to an area where it can be absorbed or stored, where the presence of water is less of a problem, like a field. While this can remove floodwater, they may also flood themselves, and it's quite an expensive solution. Finally, the most classic hard engineering example is that of dams and reservoirs. These are large structures that block the river entirely and build up a reservoir behind them. Water can then be released in a more controlled way, or used for drinking water supply, or even the generation of electricity via hydropower. Although they're expensive to build and can displace settlements unfortunate enough to be located where the reservoir will flood, these are very common all around the world. There are tens of thousands of dams on rivers globally, and they can actually have serious negative effects because on the rivers they block, they completely trap sediment as it moves downstream. Over time, this can reduce the capacity of a reservoir to store water, and it also starves the downstream river of sediment, which might cause it to erode the channel downstream upon the return of these clear water flows. So let's return to our Mekong River example one final time. We saw that the Mekong River transports huge quantities of sediment, which is eventually deposited in the Mekong Delta. Unfortunately, the Mekong Delta is in trouble and its future looks uncertain. The Mekong River is now heavily dammed, with more planned or under construction. This could trap up to 2/3 of the river sediment and starve the delta. of the material that it needs to grow. And with rising sea levels, the delta is gradually drowning because of sediment starvation, with serious consequences for food production and livelihoods. Soft engineering techniques are different. They typically don't involve building structures. More likely, they involve working with natural processes to provide more natural ways of managing flooding that are more sustainable over longer periods of time. Floodplain zoning recognises that rivers will flood, and so restricts the building that can take place on low ground. So, for instance, only fields or grazing land is allowed close to the river. Houses or industrial buildings would only be built substantially higher than a river where flooding is unlikely. In between, we might have things like car parks, sports fields, or other areas that are unlikely to result in expensive insurance claims when they flood. Now, while this idea works in principle, we can't simply wipe away centuries of riverside infrastructure. We can only really apply this idea to new developments. So another alternative is, again, to accept that the river will flood, but to mitigate that risk by ensuring that houses and buildings are prepared and giving clear flood warnings well in advance of the flood event itself. People can then protect their homes with flood defences or sandbags, move their valuables to a safe place and safely evacuate if necessary. But this is still really disruptive and expensive and relies on the warnings being communicated to everybody. Now, both these approaches exemplify the idea that we have to learn to live with flooding. And for an extreme example of this in practice, let's return to the Zambezi case study that I mentioned earlier. The Lotse people of the Barotse floodplain have adapted to their annual flooding of the Zambezi River by practicing something called transhumance. Each year, they abandon their floodplain houses and settlements and move to other villages located above the floodplain. This recognises that the flooding of the river is also the thing that is responsible for the fertile ground and abundant fish stock that made the floodplain such an attractive place to live in the first place. Now, other soft engineering techniques seek to undo the changes that humans have made to the landscape over the last few thousand years and to create the natural processes that would otherwise have been in operation. This is what we might call natural flood management, and it's becoming increasingly popular in the UK and also worldwide alongside more conventional flood defences. For example, the UK was once more forested than it is today. We've already seen that forests absorb a great deal more rainwater than agricultural or urban areas. So by replanting trees, we can restore this natural way of reducing flooding downstream. Generally, our goal here is to slow the flow in the upper part of the catchments and only gradually release the water, which helps to protect from flooding in downstream towns and cities. By restoring rivers to their natural meandering courses, we can undo previous engineering efforts to straighten them. We can reinstate small natural flood barriers, such as those made out of tree trunks and branches that would naturally have fallen into the river if the catchment had been forested. These small blockages can slow down water and cause it to spill out onto the floodplain and be retained there. And by doing this in upland areas where there's little infrastructure, we can ensure that the downstream urban areas are more resilient to floods. Let's now take an example of a UK river catchment and look at a flood management scheme there. The town of Pickering in North Yorkshire has unfortunately been flooded several times in the last few decades. Between 1999 and 2007 alone, it was flooded 4 times, and the 2007 flood cost £7 million to Pickering homes and businesses. Pickering Beck flows south off the North York moors and flows straight through the town. Similar problems were also faced in the nearby town of Sinnington in an adjacent catchment. hard engineering plans were drawn up to protect the residents and businesses following a flood risk assessment. And a cost-benefit analysis weighed up the cost of building big flood walls against the money saved by protecting the buildings. Unfortunately, it was deemed too low a priority to be considered for approval. Instead, the catchments were chosen to be a trial for natural flood management techniques in a project which started in 2009. A floodplain storage area was created just to the north of the town that could hold up to 210,000 cubic metres of water in a flood. 167 large woody dams were placed in river channels to slow the flow down before it reached the villages. New riverside and floodplain woodland areas were planted alongside other measures such as working to reduce runoff from farms. A big storm event in 2015 provided the first real test of this approach, and while nearby areas such as Leeds saw widespread flooding, Pickering was relatively unaffected. Now, this made news headlines suggesting that natural flood management techniques saved the town of Pickering from serious flooding, but in reality, no two flood events are quite the same, and Pickering actually received less rainfall than neighbouring catchments, so the truth is somewhat more complicated. A more detailed analysis suggests that a modest but important effect of the management strategy reduced flood peaks by somewhere between 15 and 20%. Now, still, given the relatively low cost and high degree of sustainability of the scheme, that is a success that isn't to be underestimated. Nonetheless, even building a small woody dam blocking a river needs some kind of maintenance. And in 2019, Forestry England began another project to trial a novel approach to maintaining these dams. In a fenced compound in Cropton Woods, 2 Eurasian beavers were released to see if they could provide a natural solution to maintaining these structures. Beavers were once native in the UK, and while they've been absent for 400 years after being hunted to extinction, they're now making a bit of a comeback through programs such as this. There are now 10 beavers in this compound in Yorkshire, and they pretty much ignored the human-built structures and have created their own much more effective dams. The main dam is thought to be the biggest beaver dam in the UK and is storing roughly 2,000 cubic metres of water. The water level at the dam has been raised by well over 1 metre, and more dams are now being built all around the compound, with huge positive impacts being noted in things like bat populations, birds, amphibians, butterflies and insects. In many ways, this is the ultimate natural flood management, restoring beaver-induced wetlands that once would have been present around much of the UK rivers and slowing the flow and progress of floodwater through the area, as we've seen from river monitoring at this Yorkshire site. It also highlights the need to see our rivers not just as a source of problems, such as flooding, but also to recognise their importance to the wider landscape and ecology, both here in the UK and across the world.